I will concentrate on Xobourgo, on late archaic and classical polis of Xobourgo on Tenos. As I was preparing my presentation for today's seminar, I realized that my title may be somewhat misleading, as I will mainly focus on kitchenware and on the tools related to textile production, that is mainly loom-weights and spindle whorls. Thus, textiles, although directly related to the small terracotta finds from Xobourgo, will not be directly treated today. This selection of small finds related to textile production and coarse and plain pottery used for the preparation and also the consumption of food and drink represents the main core of a research project generously funded by l'Académie Royale de Belgique and hosted by l'École Française d'Athènes. The main idea was to address multifunctionality of private and public spaces of a small Cycladic polis at Xobourgo on Tenos through the study of the material remains of the local craft productions. These actually represent a large corpus of finds encountered in most excavated contexts and related not only to everyday activities, but equally to the religious and ritual expressions of the communities installed in this area. Although the exact extent of the ancient city of Xobourgo seems, you can see my PowerPoint. Okay. Although the exact extent of the ancient city of Xobourgo has not been established, the investigated areas that form the focus of this research are located around the southwest and southeast slopes of the imposing hill of Xobourgo. These are the classical necropolis at Vardalakos plot that corresponds to number 1 on the plan on your screen, a sanctuary unit, some 500 meters to the southwest, dedicated to Demeter and located outside the city's wall. It is noted as number 2. And lastly, a late archaic and classical building Epsilon, the only one investigated inside the city's walls that corresponds to number 3. All 3 areas were partly excavated by Nikolaos Kontoleon at irregular intervals between the late 30s and the late 50s, and systematically investigated since 1997 by the University of Athens under the direction of Professor Emerita Notakourou, whom I thank for the invitation to study part of the material from the above areas and for the opportunity to be part of the excavations on Xobourgo for almost 2 decades now. Loom-weights and cooking pots represent, I have put some indicative bibliography on the screen for those who would like to go into Xobourgo research, the research of Xobourgo deeper. Loom-weights and cooking pots represent characteristic finds in domestic contexts linked to the economy and sustainability of the Greek oikos. Small terracotta loom-weights and spindle whorls served the preparation of the threads and the weaving of clothes and textiles, an activity traditionally reserved to the female members of a household. The preparation of the textiles was almost exclusively made using a warp-weighted loom in ancient Greece. This type of standing loom uses weights to pull down the threads of the warp, the vertical threads, along the weaver to draw the weft horizontal threads over and under in order to create the cloth. Although no looms are preserved from ancient Greece, the technical and technological aspects of weaving have been treated through analysis of the archaeological textiles, the related evidence from literary and iconographic sources, as we can see on the screen, and equally from the large corpus of tools related to weaving and spinning. The ever-growing number of related studies in this field of research has provided a renewed theoretical and practical framework for addressing textile production in ancient societies. Going beyond household economy and the activities related to the Greek oikos, the presence of loom-weights and spindle whorls at sanctuaries attests to the symbolic potency of these objects, as well as to their practical purpose. These have been commonly interpreted as votives made by female visitors to the sanctuaries of mainly female deities, Athena, Hera, Demeter, Aphrodite, and occasionally to Apollo. The dedication of the tools related to textile production, in addition to the offering of clothes and textiles, has been encountered as a token of female skill and craft production. The evidence from Xobourgo provides a slightly different view, inextricably related to the rural character of the installation and the importance of textile preparation in both everyday and religious life of the site already from an early time. Loom-weights and spindle whorls have been collected from all three areas, the sanctuary of Demeter, building Epsilon, and the classical necropolis at Vardalakos plot. A total of 293 weights related to textile manufacture can be dated to the archaic and classical periods, including loom weights, spindle whorls, and weights of either round or pyramidal shape that exceed 120 grams of weight and are defined here simply as heavy weights that will come back to those in a few minutes. It becomes quickly evident that the largest corpus of tools related to textile manufacture were found in relation to the sanctuary of Demeter, the Thesmophorion at Xobourgo. Located just in front of the city's walls, the sanctuary was identified and excavated by Nikolaos Kotoleon in the 50s. It has been variously interpreted as a domestic installation or a unit with funerary chthonic destinations since then. More recently, Notakuru has discussed in detail the plan and consecutive phases of this building, along with some of the most interesting finds, arguing on its identification as a Thesmophorion, a sanctuary dedicated to Demeter and Kore. Regrettably, we disclose only few information as to the exact finding spots of the loom weights and spindle whorls, and I have marked with this pink color the area 3, where the built altar is to be found, and area 5.1, known as the Pithos Hall, where certain of the large relief pithoi exhibited today in the small archaeological museum of Tenos were found standing in situ or broken, and in the areas just in front and to the east of the Pithos Hall, where most of these small weights seems to have been unearthed. Typologically, there are two prevailing types of loom weights, the truncated pyramidal and the lenticular ones, pinched on top, where the suspension hole is to be found. There is a certain variety of the forms related mainly to the handmade nature of these objects, yet the shapes are constantly the same. Spindle whorls are much fewer, representing almost 14% of the total. That is also logical if one thinks of how these were used for spinning and weaving. Most of them are ring-shaped with central wide transversal holes, while few are of biconical shape with a narrow hole, probably depending on the diameter of the thread produced. Heavy weights that you may see on the right of the screen are of three main types: pyramidal with a single or a pair of suspension holes, round with a central hole, and round with two suspension holes. This could have functioned as loom weights for heavier and stronger threads. Most of these have been collected from the Necropolis at Vardalakos, and we will see that in a minute, where they represent a percentage of 30% among the collected weights, when for both the other contexts, that is the Thesmophorion and the building Epsilon, they do not exceed 7% and 4% respectively. Characteristic are the stumps that some of these loom weights have, usually placed in pairs close to their suspension holes. A common representation of these stumps includes a female figure shown towards the left with one leg bent and with both hands holding an elongated object, and they look like if they are spinning or weaving. And I have tried to make the best pictures possible in the apotheke of the museum, but I'm not sure that you can distinguish what I'm talking about. The theme is quite original and entirely related to the manufacture process. Others are quite worn in order to allow a secure identification. They seem, however, to present human figures, mostly women, kneeling or sitting, and animals. Although most stamps may be found on lenticular weights, as those that we see, there are only few, actually only two, pyramidal loom weights with oval stamps. The winged pyramidal weight shown on one of them remains an original theme for Tenos and for the rest of the Cyclades. Although stamped loom weights are encountered in all three contexts under study, more than half of the pieces were found at the Thesmophorion. Loom weights and spindle whorls are difficult to date without a stratigraphic archaeological context, as they are considered to have remained in use for a long time with few stylistic changes. Yet most of the collected weights should be related to the main phase of the sanctuary, covering the second half of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. There is a small loom weight that you can see on your right, quite worn, with a suspension hole broken, that is decorated with 3 circular stamps showing small rosettes. It is possible to date this loom weight quite earlier than the others, presumably in the 6th century, thus confirming that older pieces stayed in use for a longer period of time. The one inscribed with the letters delta and eta that you can see on the left could have been related to the venerated deity, Demeter. The data from the Thesmophorion may be better evaluated when compared to the other 2 excavated contexts of approximately the same period. Building Epsilon is compiled by at least 3 rooms oriented north-south and communicating with each other. It seems that this building unit extends on both directions, east and west, and excavation has not been completed. Its exact character is expected to be clarified after the completion of the study of its architecture and finds that is currently in progress. The building has been considered in the past as one of the public buildings of the late archaic and classical polis, mainly due to the quantities of nice attic pottery found inside its rooms and the 2 fragmentary bronze allotment plates that you can see on the screen that have been taken as alluding to a public rather than to a domestic role of building Epsilon. Loom weights and spindle whorls have been identified in 2 of the excavated rooms, interestingly in proximity to the 3 large pithoi numbered as epsilon 1 to epsilon 3 that were found in situ inside rooms 1 and 3. Epsilon 1 and epsilon 3 have been associated to the first phase of the building of the late 6th century, while the larger pithos epsilon 2 was assigned to the second architectural phase of the 5th century BC. Loom weights and spindle whorls should be thus related to both these phases, dating thus from the second half of the 6th to the 5th century BC. Based on their distribution inside the 2 rooms that you can see on the screen, one could argue that more than 1 looms were stored in these rooms. Typologically, both truncated pyramidal weights and lenticular ones are encountered, thus comparable to the finds from the Thesmophorion. What is, however, interesting is the visible trend in somewhat heavier loom weights in building Epsilon and much lighter ones from the Thesmophorion. We can see that certain group of the loom weights found in the Thesmophorion weighed between 25 and 35 grams, while for building Epsilon, this is between 65 and 75 grams. Beyond that, the distribution of the loom weights in reference to their weight seems random in both cases, although it remains possible that the 160 loom weights and spindle whorls from the Thesmophorion were votive objects being stored in the building after dedication. It is equally possible that at least part of this was in use for the preparation of clothes and textiles. As for building Epsilon, their practical use cannot be questioned, and the proximity of their find spots to the large pithoi could indicate a possible area for storing the looms. it is still difficult to place spinning and weaving in a particular room inside building Epsilon, and we hope that the further study of the material from this building will clarify such issues. In general, the Greek evidence for weaving in a sanctuary context relates to the sacred weaving. This included the preparation of a cloth by a group of female weavers that was offered to the venerated deity during the religious festival. The preparation of the peplos for Athena and the offering of the garment on the Athenian Necropolis during the Panathenaea festival remains the most discussed case of sacred weaving. According to Pausanias, other local religious festivals included the preparation and offering of a garment to the deity, including Hera at Olympia and Apollo at Amycles. Although in these cases the looms were placed inside specific areas, it is difficult to archaeologically identify such areas. The lack of any fixed constructions related to the process of weaving is among the main reasons for that. Furthermore, the relatively small quantities of loom-weights and other tools related to the preparation of textiles are usually found in mixed deposits and disturbed layers within the sanctuary areas, and thus cannot be safely assigned to activities taking place in situ. At the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore at Corinth, Nancy Boukidis associated the presence of loom-weights, spindle whorls, and other textile tools found at the sanctuary area to the large corpus of 25,000 terracotta figurines of young brides and the quantity of kalathiski, commonly serving as wool baskets in the iconography of Greek vases. The scholar argued that the nature of these votive offerings would have been more suitable to young brides, thus evoking the new role they were expected to assume within the oikos. Comparable finds in other sanctuaries have been largely discussed in a similar manner. The finely decorated spindle whorls and the large number of miniature kalathiski found at the sanctuary of Hera Limenia at Perachora, or the small finely decorated spindle whorls from the sanctuary of the nymph on the south slopes of the Athenian Acropolis, considered as symbolic gifts to the nymphy by the young Athenian brides. Yet loom-weights are only rarely reported in large quantities from Greek sanctuaries, and thus they are generally considered as occasional offerings to the deity. The evidence from Xobourgo is somewhat different and may be better approached to the evidence from the Italian sanctuaries. There, the substantial number of loom-weights and other textile tools have been interpreted as evidence for the in situ preparation of textiles within areas of the sanctuary that equally served for other activities. Francavilla Marittima provides the earliest material dating from the 8th century and relating to the Enotrian traditions on the site. The so-called weaving hut precedes the construction of the consecutive Greek temples in this area. The quite large number of loom-weights and spindle whorls that were found among other votives have been related by Marianne Kleinbrink to sacred weaving that would have included the preparation and presentation of the produced textiles to the local deity. The square building at the sanctuary of Hera, at the mouth of the Selle River, has been related to women's work, including textile and food preparations, possibly even serving a storage area for certain types of dedications. Although the above evidence has been largely discussed in relation to Greek traditions on sacred weaving and presentation of the finished products to the deity, they equally provide an alternative view of how women's work may be envisaged within a sanctuary context. The evidence from Xobourgo highlights the importance of adopting a view beyond the standard one that considers terracotta textile tools as symbolic ex voto. In addition to being personal dedications, these represent at the same time actual production tools, and these two functions need not to be mutually exclusive. The third area where loom-weights and spindle whorls have been identified is the classical necropolis at Vardalakos plot. The necropolis develops on both sides of what seems to have been a narrow road that I have marked here with these yellow lines, leading from the city to the country of Xobourgo. Although the exact distance between the necropolis and the entrance to the city remains an issue to be defined. Clusters of graves have been excavated to the south of this main road, while to the north, a number of low-built constructions seem to have been intentionally organized along the south and east sides of the long building Zeta that dominates this part of the burial ground. I have placed all finds from the recent excavations on this drone photo of the site. To these, one should add few more from the old excavations that seem to have been found mainly on the northern part of the necropolis, where the stone constructions are arranged. An interesting feature here is the almost complete absence of spindle whorls and the quite large quantity of the heavyweights. This is a selection here on your screen of the most characteristic and better preserved ones, weighing in between 193 and 546 grams. These represent 30% of the material, that is much higher in comparison to the finds from the Thesmophorion and building Epsilon. Their exact function is unclear, and few, mainly those that do not have any suspension hole that you can see on your right, cannot be described as loom-weights. These have been variously interpreted as weights or as cake models offered to the deceased. At Xobourgo, these, however, are quite few. There are 3 pieces from the necropolis and 1 more from building Epsilon. As for the rest of the small loom weights from the necropolis, they were found mostly in fill layers, and nothing more can be said. There is no loom weight found inside the tombs, and thus an interpretation as burial gifts cannot be confirmed at Xobourgo. On the other hand, there is a substantial quantity found on and around the seized constructions on the northern part of the area, and equally in relation to pyre pits excavated among the tombs on the southern part of the necropolis. We may thus argue that these small weights had a symbolic function in the funerary context, and presumably equally practical one during rituals and ceremonies performed by the visitors at the cemetery area. This brings us again to the second part of today's seminar, the potential use and function of large corpus of utilitarian ware, namely cooking pots, that have been found in the cemetery area. Commonly found in domestic contexts, cooking pots and plain ware remain atypical, at least in substantial quantities, from other contexts. The finding of this class of pottery in the cemetery of the classical period provides a new approach on its use and eventual disposal within the space reserved for the dead. Plain ware and cooking pots were almost exclusively found on the northern part of the necropolis, broken and left on the surface of the area around the low stone constructions that are organized along the south and east sides of the long building Zeta. Their arrangement on both sides of building Zeta are indicative of their addition sometime after the construction of the building. For our discussion today, we shall focus on certain areas only, as numbered on the topographical plan of this part of the necropolis prepared by Thanasis Kouros. These areas have offered large and rather homogeneous pottery assemblances. This means that almost entire shapes can be reconstructed from the much fragmentary material collected from these areas, pointing to the in situ intentional breakage of the pots, probably after the successful completion of the activities. Stone construction 51, that I have marked also in orange on the topographical plan, and this is a photo from north and from the east, was found close to the western limit of building Zeta, partly built on the natural rock. Its form is quite different from the rest of the almost square or rectangular constructions, while its building reveals different construction phases that you can see also on the screen using different construction materials. The accumulation of hundreds of surds on the surface and along the sides of this stone construction and this is the stone construction 51 during excavation, provide a consistent pattern as to how these deposits were formed, despite the much fragmentary state of the material. And this is how we have the material in the apotheke now, trying to find joints between the serts. Entire pots may be reconstructed, namely lopades and hitre that represent more than half of the quantified material from the spot. Similar forms seem repeated in each one of the areas dated from the second half of the 5th to the late 4th century. And I have only selected this deposit from the area north of wall 42, and you can see the joints between the pottery serge, and also this one, the stone construction 10, how pottery is found in the field and how we treat it in the apotheke, and again the deposit from the area of stone construction 37. The fabric of these pots is very much characteristic, covering a color range from strong orange to reddish brown, mostly semi-fine and considered as relevant to the local pottery production. Among the most characteristic pottery shapes collected from these deposits are the small casseroles, the lopas, either lidded or not, the cooking pot, the hitre, with one and rarely two handles, and the basins, the lekane, commonly with two horizontal and rolled in section handles. Lopades reach standard dimension with a diameter at rim between 18 and 24 centimeters, while few larger recipients may even reach 33 centimeters in diameter and almost 15 centimeters high. Several specimens can be matched with shallow domed lids with the distinctive button-like knobs that we can really see in the excavation. Yet, from the quantitative and the qualitative analysis of the material, it seems that only a small percentage of the lopas, calculated between 15 and 25% in the relevant deposits, were lidded, while the majority ended open in the deposits after probably being used in this way. In addition, less than 1/3 of the lopas were heavily burned on the outside, some on the inside as well. These observations offer a different aspect of the use of these vessels that, despite their inextricable relation to the preparation of food within the household, they seem to have served in a more varied way ritual performance at the graveyards. Lopades are to be found in a consistently high percentage, representing 60 to 65% of the quantified material from the stone constructions, and I'm presenting you here some 3 such assemblances, and thus providing the commonest recipient during activities performed at the site. Complementary to lopades are hitre and lekane, representing around 10 and 15% respectively. Hitre, as equally lopades, show only small variations of the profile shapes and size. Due to the fragmentation of the material, no entire profile has been reconstructed, and thus variation of the body and bottom cannot be identified, at least at this point of study. Yet from the numerous rim fragments, it has been possible to identify one-handled hitre as the prevailing type at Xobourgo, while two-handled examples are extremely rare. The rim diameter reaches around 14 centimeters, and for the largest examples does not exceed 18 to 19 centimeters. The profile shape of the lip and upper body does not match exactly the Athenian examples, following the elongated forms of the archaic period that we also have at Xobourgo. No lids have been yet matched to the hitre. Lekane are the only of these 3 types that are found in both plain and coarse ware, that is a nicely levigated fabric and a much coarser one. The specimens from Xobourgo have generally a wide mouth reaching up to 55 centimeters in diameter and a body profile that could reach 25 to 30 centimeters. Lekane from Xobourgo follow the main sequence of the late 5th and 4th century Attic recipients, with the difference that banded ware are completely absent from Xobourgo. Lopades chytre, and lekane represent thus the 80% of pottery assemblances. Other types found occasionally in the material include hydrie, askoi, and plates, mainly dated to the late 5th century. Other shapes include large lids of steamed bowls, identified in almost all assemblances by their characteristic molded foot or knob. Complementary are the few Attic black glazed skyphoi and cantharoi collected from the deposits. These represent from 2 to 8% of the material, and thus their consistently low numbers seem better adapted to their use as libation vessels, presumably marking specific moments during the rituals, than in relation to consumption and drinking. Lastly, noteworthy is the presence of mortars and stands in the pottery deposits from the stone constructions. Mold-made mortars are commoner in contexts of the 5th century, yet equally present in the context of the second half of the 4th. This large and heavy household ware should not have been that easy to carry around. Their presence in the cemetery area, and indeed in relation to the stone constructions, remains puzzling, unless we accept that grain was pounded there as part of the rituals. Complementary to the use of mortars seem to have been some heavy pithos bases, some of which found in situ on top of the stone constructions. The visible friction marks on the bottom of these bases point to a probable use as mortars as well. Cooking stands belong to the mobile cooking equipment, and their frequency at Xobourgo is not that surprising. Cooking stands and braziers belong to a long potting tradition at Xobourgo and seem to have been an inextricable part of the ritual activities that took place at the open already from the late 8th century. The fragmentary material from the stone constructions at the Necropolis do not allow for a complete reconstruction of their profile. They seem, however, to have formed a tall, fenestrated ring that reached approximately 13 to 15 centimeters high and a diameter at the base of 22 centimeters from the smallest specimens and up to 35 for the larger ones. Assemblances of plain ware and cooking pots of the classical period, principally known from domestic contexts, from the Athenian agora and the Attic countryside at Vari, on the north slopes of the Mount Egalion in front of the Dima wall, from the area of the later form in Corinth, from the ancient Allies in the Argolid, and from Olynthos, among others. The pottery assemblances from Xobourgo correspond to the repertory of the household equipment from the above contexts, mainly related to the preparation of aliments and their cooking. Other shapes related to storage and consumption that form large categories of finds from the above domestic context that I have used here only the results from the Dima house and the Bari houses, the quantification of the material, are practically absent from the deposits of Xobourgo. Still, a more detailed look into the composition of the deposits equally reveals pronounced differences among the material from Xobourgo and the variety of shapes represented in the above household contexts. Furthermore, on the contrary to the predominance of the lopas in the assemblances from Xobourgo, in other contemporary contexts, chytre represent the commonest and largest category. Susan Rotroff calculated the number of the chytre from the area of the Athenian agora as almost double in comparison to the lopas in the contexts dating to the classical and Hellenistic periods. In addition to domestic contexts, plain ware and cooking pots are occasionally reported in relation to sacrificial pyre from funerary contexts of the 5th and 4th century. Within the family perivolos of Phanocrates from Rhamnous in Attica, more than one sacrificial pyre are reported. Pottery collected from these areas consists mainly of cooking pots, lopades and chytre, black glazed cantharoi, askoi, and other smaller shapes, all dating to the last quarter of the 4th century, according to the publication by Vasilios Petrakos. The largest assemblance of all is reported to have contained almost 100 pots, mended from numerous fragments. Likewise, a similar pyra has been reported from the funerary enclosure of Dionysius from Kolytos in Athenian Keramaikos. The pottery assemblance has not been yet fully published, yet the photo of the deposit during excavation is largely comparable to the evidence from Xobourgo. Olga Kakavogianni reports of similar finds from the large burial enclosure at Pousiledi, investigated in the modern area of Paeania in East Attica. Evidence for comparable rituals involving the intentional destruction of cooking pots within the cemetery area comes from the east and southeast Attica, namely the large necropolis of Phoenicia in the modern area of Saronida close to Anavissos, and the area of Merenda in proximity to the burial grounds of the classical period. Remains of black glazed pottery, along with miniature shapes and plain kitchenware, are reported from Pyre, but with no visible connection to contemporary constructions. Although finds from both areas are only summarily represented in preliminary reports, a date for the late 5th and 4th century has been reported for the finds at Phoenicia, and the latter half of the 4th for the finds at Merenda. Yet, a distinguishing feature of the rituals performed at Xobourgo is the role of the stone-built platforms that seem to have formed the focus of the activities. Comparable square and rectangular stone constructions have been reported from the Attic cemeteries, commonly thought to have supported stone stele or other stone markers for the deceased. These, however, are generally related to family enclosures and tombs and do not take the dense arrangement found at Xobourgo. At least for the ones we have investigated so far at Xobourgo, they do not seem to have covered any grave, but they were founded directly on the natural rock. It is possible that certain of them equally served for the placement of the stone funerary monuments that would have been erected within the cemetery. Indeed, a number of stone bases and some fragmentary stone stele and larger monuments have been found during the old and the recent excavations at the site, providing a view of the wealth by means of funerary display of the inhabitants. Yet the predominance of plain and kitchenware from this area is certainly impressive and comes in complete opposition to the southern part of the cemetery, where large quantities of most drinking vessels, skyphoi, cantharoi, and kilikes of good quality were collected from the fill layers of the tombs and the surrounding area. Whether one should consider the material from this part of the necropolis as complementary to that from the stone constructions, and thus representing two successive stages of the rituals performed there, remains a logical assumption. On the other hand, there seems to exist a quite sharp distinction between the material used and deposited in the two areas of the cemetery. Alternatively, could such pronounced differences be taken as a criterion for distinguishing between private rituals performed by the family and kins at the grave during the funerals and thereafter, and communal rituals in the context of the annual festivals organized by the polis as part of its official cults? At Athens, on the third day of the Anthesteria, celebrated on the 13th of month Anthesterion, the Hetroid took place that involved the consumption of a specific porridge based on water and containing cereals and honey. The vessels that contained the foodstuff were offered to Hermes Chthonios, celebrating his role as Psychopombos. According to Walter Burkett, the consumption of this porridge at Athens derived from a collective mythical tradition, thus providing a specific chthonic framework for the rituals. At the Spartan sanctuary of Apollo Iakynthos at Amykles, the two separate parts of the religious rituals that were addressed to the hero Iakynthos and to god Apollo involved different food preparations and their consumption by the participants, according to the detailed description of Atheneus. Food preparations were specific to festivals with chthonic character, an aspect common in many cultures and societies up to our days. It is possible that these meals represented a symbolic repetition of the food consumed at the funerals, especially those organized for the prominent members of the society. These communal rituals provided a cohesive framework for the participants in assuring the sustainability and continuity of local traditions and myths. Although this hypothesis remains to be further explored for the case of Xobourgo, we should highlight the uniformity of the pottery used and disposed in both areas and the regularity of these rituals from the late 5th and throughout the 4th century. The consistent use of kitchenware and household-related pottery of local production for ritual activity at the site can be taken as a strong argument for addressing the local character of the ceremonies and presumably also their old origins. In addition to pottery, loom-weights are the only other category of finds from this area, further alluding to the role of women in the activities in situ, responsible for the everyday food preparations and also for the substantial part of the textile production, as equally for the funerary rituals and the care for the dead body. It seems logical to place the activity of women in the center of ritual performance at the site. Thank you very much for your attention.